All right, so lesson one of trigonometry. In trigonometry, we're dealing with right triangles only. And so previously, if we had a right triangle and we were given two side lengths, we would find the third side by using Pythagorean theorem. But what is really awesome about trigonometry is if we just have one side length and an angle, which are both very easy to measure in real life, we can use these ratios to figure out other sides and possibly other angles as well. So these are the three trig functions we're going to use. There's actually six, but we focus on three in this class. One is called sine, the other is cosine, and the third is tangent. And this symbol here is theta, it's the Greek letter, and that represents the angle in the particular triangle that things are going to be based on. So the very first thing you have to learn is how to identify the three sides, because the three sides give us various ratios. So the three sides are going to be opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse. So if we look at this triangle here, the opposite and adjacent are going to be based on the angle, what angle is given in the problem. So sometimes the angle will be given by theta, sometimes an x, or sometimes just the letter of the vertice. So in this case, this would be angle B, or we know it's this angle theta because the symbol given. So based on this, what we do is we would draw an arrow across, and that arrow to me is like a bullseye, and that's going to be the side opposite. Opposite being if you had a bullseye target that you would shoot it at. So that's kind of the visual representation. So every problem you get, first thing you do is draw an arrow, and that side represents the opposite side. The side across from the 90-degree angle is going to be the hypotenuse. So using those two arrow techniques, we know that this side has to be called the adjacent side. And so for every problem, we have to identify these three sides. Okay? Once we do that, then we'll take a look at an example in a second on how that works, because you're going to be given one of them, an angle, and you have to find a third. And depending on what you're given and what you're trying to find will determine which of these three things you use. So for example, if we're using sine, we would use the opposite and the hypotenuse. So we would have to be given this or find this, and then vice versa for this. So that would be sine. If we were doing cosine, it would be the adjacent side with the hypotenuse, these two sides. Cosine would be like side angle side, going back to some things that we've talked about in the past, in terms of visually what you see, okay? All right, and then the last would be tangent, and that's gonna be opposite over adjacent. Tangent is the two sides that make up the right angle, the two legs would be the tangent function, okay? All right, so again, sine in this case would be opposite over adjacent, which would be AC over AB. Cosine would be adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent would be opposite over adjacent. So you have to master this first. On every problem, identify it, put an O, A, and H next to each of the sides for every single problem that you do. All right, so here's an example where we're going to find the ratio. So there's three types of problems: writing the ratios, finding the side length, and finding missing angles. So this is the first type of problem we're going to have in trig. Today we're going to focus only on tangents. So I introduced sine, cosine, and tangent, but today is only going to be tangent. We'll talk about sine and cosine in the next lesson. So in this problem, we're going to start from angle A. So from angle A, if we want tangent, that's opposite over hypotenuse. And one way to remember this is a phrase called SOHCAHTOA. And it's similar to like an Indian name like Sacagawea. So we say SOHCAHTOA, and that allows us to say sine is opposite over hypotenuse, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent is opposite over adjacent. And so if we're doing tangent, we need opposite and adjacent. Okay, and so we have this. So from angle A, remember we draw the arrow and that becomes opposite. And do we need opposite and tangent? We do. Okay, and the other thing we need then is to draw the hypotenuse. We don't need the hypotenuse and tangent, which means this has to be the adjacent side, which is why we get 20 over 21 in this example. Now, when we do the same thing from angle B, things change. Okay, so from angle B, This is where we're starting from. We shoot the arrow and the arrow hits the opposite side. We draw from the 90 degree, we find the hypotenuse. We don't need the hypotenuse, which means this side is now the adjacent. Okay, so notice how the fractions in these two examples switched based on the angle that was our given angle. Okay, so now let's try this one here. So if we do angle K, when we go opposite, 3 would be opposite. The hypotenuse would be opposite the 90, which is the side we're not given, which means 7 has to be the adjacent side. Okay, now from J we shoot opposite. This would be our hypotenuse, which means this is adjacent. So again, tangent is opposite over adjacent, which in this case would be 7 over 3. All right, so now let's take a look at how to solve angles. And there's 2 types of problems for solving angles. All right, so in this case, we don't know what we're gonna use in the problem, sine, cosine, or tangent. So again, we start with this angle. We never use the 90-degree angle for these calculations. So when we shoot the arrow, this becomes opposite. This becomes hypotenuse, which we don't have, which means this has to be adjacent. So in this case, we would set up our equation because we have opposite and adjacent, we use tangent. So as tangent of the angle that's given is equal to opposite over adjacent. Okay, so that's how we would set this up. Tangent of the angle is equal to opposite over adjacent. Now in this case, because the variable's on top, we're going to cross multiply. So in the calculator, you would hit 10 times tangent 54. And when you do that, you should get 13.8. So when the variable's on top, we cross multiply. This is something we're gonna do a lot, so make sure you, in your head, rehearse this for every problem we have. All right, over here, I want you to use 33 in this example, and you'll understand why in a second. We could use 57, but for now, use this. So if I shoot my arrow, 2.5 becomes the opposite side. That means W is going to be the adjacent side. So over here, if you look, we take tangent of the angle, and that is equal to 2.5 over W. Now in this case, the variable's on the bottom. So what we're going to do is what I call switch. The variable and the tangent are going to switch places. So if you look at what I drew here, you see the variable moves and the tangent moves down. And now we're going to divide. So in the calculator, you would type this divided by that, and you should get 3.8 as your answer. So these are the 2 ways that you're going to solve equations in trig, whether it's sine, cosine, or tangent. The variable will be on top or the variable will be on bottom when you're trying to find a side length. Okay, so think about what I just said and really review that because that's really important to know. All right, so here's a real-world example. Trigonometry, there's lots of real-world examples. Finding heights and distances of things, and the angles are easy to measure. So here's an example. We can measure the distance on the ground, and we have tools to measure the angles. So we can actually figure how tall a tree is without actually measuring it. So in this case, the angle is here, and they want you to estimate the height of the tree. So the height of the tree would be the opposite side of our right triangle. This would become the adjacent side, so we're using tangent. Now in this case, the variable's on top, and if you remember just a few minutes ago, we talked if the variable's on top, we're gonna cross multiply. So 125 times tangent 32, and you should get a height of about 78.1 feet. Okay. All right, the last type of problem is what happens if you're given 2 values, but you need to find the angle measure. How many degrees is the particular angle? So when you need to find the angle, we're going to use the -1 button on the calculator. For most of you, that's going to be hitting the second button, which is usually located in the top left. Sometimes it's a shift button, and then hitting the tangent button for this particular lesson. Sometimes sine and cosine, which will come later. So again, hit the second and then tangent, and that should give you the -1 button, the inverse button. So in this example here, we want to find the angle y. So based on angle y, this would become opposite, this would become adjacent. So we set our equation up like this. The tangent of the angle that we don't know, that's what we're trying to find, is equal to opposite over adjacent. So now in this case, what we do is this is going to go into we're going to hit second tangent and then type the fraction. And when we do that, you should get about 68 degrees when you round it. Okay. Now over here, we're going to find angle R. So angle R is here. We shoot the arrow. That becomes opposite. This becomes adjacent. So we're going to do tangent -1 of opposite over adjacent. And you should get a value close to 49 degrees. Okay, so there's a lot of new things in this lesson. You should review this lesson several times to pick up the things that I'm explaining on how to solve the problems.